The material for this lecture comes from Chapter 8. I will not be covering all the material in the chapter, and we'll actually be introducing some outside concepts, so make sure that you read the chapter on your own, and you can email me if you have any questions about the material. So for this lecture we are looking at the ontological argument, which was first proposed by Anselm of Canterbury. As way of introduction, I'll begin by saying that this argument is perhaps the most confusing. And the reason why this argument is confusing is because the nature of the argument relies on having a proper definition of God. A definition which says that God is that which none greater can be conceived. The argument essentially states that if we have a proper definition of God, then we will see that God's existence is clear based upon that proper definition. Now, I need to admit that the first time I heard this argument, I was very unimpressed, and most students, in fact, are very unimpressed when they first hear this argument and consider it the least persuasive of the classical arguments for God's existence. Now, having said that, it surprised me to hear that professional philosophers and intellectuals throughout history have actually had heated debates over this argument. Some philosophers have found it very compelling, and some philosophers, very good philosophers, have gone to great lengths to try to show where the fallacy is in this argument. And so it's interesting that even though when you're first introduced to it, it seems like the least persuasive, it's also one that's been perhaps more debated than the other arguments. And so to begin, what I plan to do in this lecture is I first want to introduce you to the most simplistic, and it will be the most unpersuasive version of the argument, and this is the one that most students think of when they're first exposed to it. And I want to move to more articulate versions of it, more persuasive versions of it, hopefully try to give some sort of sense of why philosophers would even consider this. So we'll begin with the most popular understanding of the argument to kick us off. So some say the argument should be articulated this way. First premise, I have an idea of a perfect God. Second premise, God would be more perfect if he existed than not. Conclusion, therefore, God exists. Without thinking about this argument for long, many will be tempted to think that this is just a joke. How do you move from having an idea of a perfect God to a conclusion that that God therefore exists? Common criticisms arise throughout the entire argument. So we might look at the first premise and say, well, who says your idea of perfect is the right idea? Who says your idea is perfect? Because perfection is usually considered to be subjective. So who says it's the perfect idea of God? And if you look at premise 2, it's more perfect for God to exist than if he did not. Well, who says that? Why would the idea of God be more perfect if he actually existed? Some have critiqued and said, maybe God would be more impressive if he created the universe while not existing. Maybe that would be a more impressive idea of God. So a non-existing God created the universe, which is much harder than an existent God created the universe. So there seems to be questions with premise 2. But even if you embrace premises 1 and 2, the conclusion somehow seems underwhelming because this argument can prove a perfect anything. A perfect island, a perfect ice cream cone. So all you have to do is just walk back through the argument. I have an idea of a perfect ice cream cone. Okay, premise 2, a perfect ice cream cone would be more perfect if it existed than not. What's the conclusion? The conclusion is that a perfect ice cream cone exists. Well, that hardly seems persuasive, and perhaps this is why many think that this whole argument just seems to be a big puzzle. Why would someone even go through with continuing talking about this after this? Well, this puzzlement is expressed quite humorously in Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion. Here he represents the argument as sort of a childish conversation between school kids arguing out in the playground. And so the first kid says, bet you I can prove God exists. Second kid says, bet you can't. Well, right then, imagine the most perfect, perfect, perfect thing possible. Okay, now what? Now, is that perfect, perfect, perfect thing real? Does it exist? Well, no, it only exists in my mind. But if it was real, it would be even more perfect because a really, really perfect thing would have to be better than a silly old imaginary thing. So I've proved that God exists. Well, this simplistic treatment certainly represents the feeling most people have when they encounter the argument. But is this the best way to think of the ontological argument? If it were, we would be puzzled why philosophers, even atheist philosophers such as Bertrand Russell, made comments like this. Russell says, I remember the precise moment one day in 1894 as I was walking along Trinity Lane when I saw a flash, or thought I saw, that the ontological argument is valid. Now, remember, back from our lecture on logic, if an argument is valid, that means that the structure of the argument is a good structure. So if the premise is true, it's just looking at the structure of the argument. So whether or not the argument is sound depends on whether or not we accept the premises to be actually true. And so Russell continues, I had gone out to buy a tin of tobacco, and on my way back, I suddenly threw it up in the air and exclaimed, as I caught it, Great Scott, the ontological argument is sound. Now, to say that an argument is sound is to say not only is the structure of the argument valid, a valid structure, but it's also to say that the premises of the argument are true. And so remember, if you have premises that are true, a structure that is valid, you have a sound argument, which means that the conclusion therefore must be true. So calling the ontological argument a sound argument is a startling admission for an atheist philosopher like Russell. But even though he admitted this certainly was not enough to cause him to rethink his atheism. He considered the argument to be sound, but he said that there was still a feeling that he had that there must be something wrong with the argument. At a different time, Russell said that the argument does not, to a modern mind, seem very convincing, but it's easier to feel convinced than that it must be fallacious than to find out precisely where the fallacy lies. And so Russell says, we can't see what the fallacy is, but we feel like there's a fallacy, even though we can't articulate what it is. So I want to move on now to a more full version of the argument to see why someone like Russell would even say something like the ontological argument is sound. So here's another way to express the argument in 7 steps. This isn't exactly what's in your textbook, but it's close. So the first step of the argument would go something like this. God exists in the understanding, but not in reality. The argument begins by assuming the opposite of what the argument is intending to prove for the sake of reducing that assumption to absurdity and thus demonstrating the idea that God exists in the understanding, but also in reality. So that's we start with the negation of what we're trying to prove. Step 2, and this is our first premise of the argument. Existence in reality is greater than existence in the understanding alone. 3, God's existence in reality is conceivable. That is, we could conceive of God existing in reality. 4, if God did exist in reality, then he would be greater than he is. That's from premises 1 and 2. Because we see that God exists just in the understanding, according to this argument. He doesn't exist in reality. So now we're saying, premise 2, that existence in reality is greater. So what follows from that is if God did exist in reality, then he'd be greater than he is. 5, it is conceivable that there is a being greater than God is. This is from steps 3 and 4 of the argument. 6, it is conceivable that there is a being greater than the being which nothing greater can be conceived. because remember, our definition of God is that which none greater can be conceived, which to even say this statement is a contradiction. But this logically follows from the argument so far. It is conceivable that there is a being greater than the greatest conceivable being. Well, how can you have a being greater than the greatest? And so what's the conclusion? 7. It is false that God exists in the understanding, but not in reality. Well, how shall we evaluate this argument? Is there any validity to it? Is it in fact sound? The first thing to say about it is what I said earlier, that this argument is really an argument about the definition of God, namely as a being who is that which none greater can be conceived. So if there is to be any merit to this definition, then there might be something to this argument. It's not. I don't think it should be regarded as a proof for God's existence, but rather as an argument for why God should be defined as this type of being. So one potential merit that it might have is it could be used as a critique against actually a famous objection against belief in God, and we'll cover that in a moment, but it's the belief that's known as the evidentialist critique against theism. So to understand how we might use the ontological argument, let's begin with that critique. The evidentialist critique against God has been popularized in the past decade by a group of public intellectuals known as the New Atheists. And so members of this group would include people like Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, Lawrence Krauss, Victor Stenger, the now deceased Christopher Hitchens, and others. Now, while the New Atheism has popularized this argument, it was perhaps most famously stated by Bertrand Russell when he said this. Russell wrote, "Many orthodox people speak as though it were the business of skeptics to disprove the received dogmas rather than of dogmatists to prove them. This, of course, is a mistake. If I were to suggest that between Earth and Mars there was a china teapot revolving around the sun in an elliptical orbit, nobody would be able to disprove my assertion, provided that I was careful enough to add that the teapot is too small to be revealed even by the most powerful telescopes. But if I were to go on to say that since my assertion cannot be disproved, that it is an intolerable presumption on the part of human reason to doubt it, I should rightly be thought of as to be talking nonsense." So what is Russell saying here? What Russell is saying is that there are many objects, mythical objects, for him, a teapot orbiting around the sun, but there have been many objects, Yahweh, the flying spaghetti monster, Zeus, the Mormon Heavenly Father. This is how the New Atheists present the argument. There are hundreds of thousands of mythical deities that have been proposed, and mythical creatures that have been proposed by either the world religions of the world, or even in comic books or whatever. A number of mythical creatures, objects, that presumably are claimed to exist. Well, now, who has the burden of proof to show that these objects don't exist? Is it the part of the skeptic to disprove every single one of these objects? Well, Russell is arguing no, because the skeptic is not making any claim. The skeptic is waiting for the person who is proposing beliefs in teapots, flying spaghetti monsters, Zeus, etc. The skeptic is waiting for the proponent of that position to present evidence for it. And until that happens, the a-teapotist, or the a-flying spaghettiist, or the a-Zeusist, or the atheist is justified in not believing. To put it another way, one is justified in lacking belief in God if she does not see evidence for God. And so if one wants to argue that the Mormon Heavenly Father exists, then one needs to provide evidence. If one wants to argue that Zeus exists, or that the flying spaghetti monster exists, or that Yahweh exists, then one needs to provide evidence. The atheist, however, is not making a claim. and therefore the atheist should not have the burden to disprove the existence of every mythical deity proposed by the various religions. Now, on first hearing of this argument, it comes across as quite persuasive and very powerful. However, there are two common responses to this claim. The first one simply challenges the foundation of the argument, the epistemological foundation of the argument, which is evidentialism, and it attempts to point out how evidentialism is self-refuting. We won't go into that right now. When we get to our part on epistemology, we'll talk about rationalism, evidentialism, and such, and we'll talk about that then. But that's one approach that theists will often take to respond to the evidentialist challenge. Another response, and this is one where the ontological argument comes in, is to challenge, to state that this challenge misunderstands the theistic definition of God. And so Anselm's ontological argument is foundational for understanding this second response. And so we will look at that real briefly. So misunderstanding God. What does Anselm's argument tell us about a common misunderstanding of God? Well, here are a few things. First, Anselm's concept of God causes us to think about two different types of beings. That is, beings that are contingent and beings that are necessary, or to use his word, that which none greater can be conceived. And so if we understand God correctly, Anselm argues that God is that which none greater can be conceived, which is a necessary being. And so when we talk about God, we have to understand God as a necessary being, not as a contingent being. And so if this is a correct definition, then what does this mean? Well, it might help to draw a picture. Suppose this box represents the whole realm of contingent beings. So contingent beings are beings that whose existence are not logically necessary. So I am a contingent being, you are a contingent being. What makes us a contingent being is that we do not have to exist. It is possible that I would not exist. It is possible that my parents wouldn't have conceived of me, and if that were the case, then I would have never been brought into this world, and so there is a possible world where Mike Burhow does not exist. It's also possible that this room that I'm sitting in, or the room that you're sitting in, does not exist because the architects maybe would not have designed it, and the contractors may not have built it. So it's possible that this world will not have existed. We could think of many things that where it's possible for them not to exist. It's possible for this world not to exist, or we might even say for the whole universe not to exist. Looking back again to Anaximander, when he's saying that all is apeiron, and we sort of went through a thought experiment, or going back to the cosmological argument, what does it mean to say that nothing exists? What's possible to negate the universe, the world, the room, you and me. These are all realms of contingent beings. Well, now if you take this thought experiment to the next step, you might ask, well, is there anything for which it's logically impossible to think that it doesn't exist? If you answer yes, then there is another realm of necessary beings. These would be beings that are self-existent, and their negation cannot be rationally conceived. It is impossible for them not to exist. So when we're talking about the Mormon Heavenly Father, the teapot, Zeus, the flying spaghetti monster, etc., these are all beings that might be considered contingent beings. That is, it is possible for them not to exist. But Anselm is arguing that if we have a correct definition of God, God should not be understood as a contingent being, but as a necessary being. So again, going back to the cosmological argument, And Immanuel Kant, actually, when he was critiquing the common arguments for God's existence, said that really all of the arguments, the cosmological argument, relies upon having a proper understanding of the ontological argument. So if you get rid of the ontological arguments, the other arguments seem to fail. And here's why I think he was saying this. If you ask what is outside the universe, which is what we did with the cosmological argument, we might say that since we are inside the universe, we cannot test, taste, touch, or observe what's outside the universe, since by definition, the things outside the universe are things that are not physical. So evidential categories do not work here. This does not mean that we're helpless, however, because we can infer what it's not, like it's not the universe. It's a reality wholly different than what the universe is that we experience. And so either that reality is personal or impersonal, such as we were talking about in the cosmological argument. Anselm argues that it is personal. So now this is a critique against the evidentialist challenge, because if atheism really is a lack of belief in this definition of God, in Anselm's definition of God, then to say that you lack belief in God, ultimate personality, would be to say that you espouse ultimate impersonality. At least that's how the critique would go. And so it doesn't help the atheist to say we just lack belief and we're not making a claim, because Anselm's claim is a claim about what is ultimately real, and if it's personal, the negation of that is impersonal, and therefore the atheism is stuck making a claim, namely that what exists, what's necessary, is that which is ultimately impersonal. And so let's look at the argument again. So God exists in the understanding, but not in reality. Existence in reality is greater than existence in the understanding alone. God's existence in reality is conceivable. If God did exist in reality, then he'd be greater than he is. It is conceivable that there is a being greater than God is, which is to say that there is a being that is greater than that which none greater can be conceived, which is a contradiction. Therefore, 7, it is false that God exists in the understanding, but not in reality. Now, this is a valid argument, but here is the main question. The main question is premise 2 true? Is existence in reality really greater than existence in the understanding alone? There are many ways that philosophers and theologians have argued for premise 2, and there have been many critiques against it. But to try to get at what Anselm might be talking about here, again, let's go back to a thought experiment. So we've already said you can conceive of this room not existing. You can conceive of this university, SDSU, not existing. You can conceive of you not existing. You can conceive of the world not existing. You can conceive of the universe not existing, but can you conceive of nothing existing? Well, whatever label you put on nothing, it's simply the negation of the universe, and so we seem to conceive of something that is ultimate, and that is a necessary being. And so Anselm's argument would simply be, or one way to formulate the argument and support premise 2, is just say it's inconceivable to conceive of a necessary being not existing. That's inconceivable. Well, what have been the major objections to this argument? The most famous one is the greatest conceivable island objection. This is Ganelio's objection. Ganelio was a contemporary with Anselm, and so they wrote back and forth to each other. Ganelio was actually a theist and did believe in God's existence, but he just thought that Anselm's argument was severely flawed. And so Ganelio writes, "You cannot any more doubt that this island, that is more excellent than all other islands, truly exists somewhere in reality, than you can doubt that it is in your mind. And since it is more excellent to exist not only in the mind alone, but also in reality, therefore it must need be that it exists. For if it did not exist, any other island existing in reality would be more excellent than it. And so this island, already conceived by you to be more excellent than any other, will it not be more excellent? Well, Anselm did respond to this argument, and one can argue whether or not Anselm's argument hits the mark. But here's what he says. Anselm simply says, an island is a contingent being, and therefore it is not that which is none greater can be conceived. So contingent beings do not exist out of necessity. Ganelio, therefore, makes a category mistake. And so Anselm's reply to Ganelio is very much like modern replies to the evidentialist critique who say that we could just prove Zeus, Thor, Dionysus, all the other so-called gods. And Anselm says you're making a category mistake. The greatest conceivable being, a necessary being, is different from a category, or different from a contingent being. So what should we say? Is this a good response? Well, some of the greatest philosophers like Descartes, Kant, Leibniz, Hume, and many others have disagreed over whether or not Anselm's argument was a good response to it, and they've presented very sophisticated responses on both sides. Kant, for example, said what Anselm got wrong here is that he argued that existence is a predicate, or should not be considered a predicate. In other words, existence should not be considered a perfection. So to say that something exists does not add anything to our conception of it. So we can conceive of God, but saying that God exists versus God not existing doesn't add anything to our idea of God, and so existence should not be considered a predicate. And so the debates go back and forth. But to this day, there have been common arguments that continue to go on with the ontological argument, more sophisticated arguments, such as the modal argument proposed by Alvin Plantinga. Again, this isn't in your chapter, but there is something very similar to this in your chapter, so read through those if you don't understand what I'm talking about in the lecture. Hopefully the two will complement each other. But to understand the modal ontological argument, you have to understand possible world semantics. And so a possible world is a hypothetical reality or something that could have been in theory. It is possible that there's a world where I don't exist. It's possible where there's a world where there would have only been 3 million people that exist versus 7 billion people that exist. And so to talk about possible worlds, we have our actual world, which we'll call X. This is the world that we actually live in. This is a world where I am a philosophy instructor, and this semester you are a philosophy student. But of course, things could have been very different. There's a possible world A where there would have not been a philosophy course, or there's a possible world where you would have taken a different philosophy course, not intro to philosophy, but maybe you took intro to ethics. Maybe you were deciding to take a math course instead, and for some reason you decided to take philosophy, and maybe now you're regretting that you're taking philosophy. But all of these, possible world A, B, C, and D, these represent really an infinite number of outcomes that could have happened in the world, but the actual world A is the world that we actually lived in. So possible world semantics, sometimes understood as modal logic, is to help us understand all the possibilities of what are actually possible. So Mike exists in X, so I exist in the actual world, but I don't exist in A. And so what this statement says is that I do exist in the actual world, but it was possible that I would have never been conceived, and therefore there is a possible world where I don't exist. But now consider this sentence. A square has 4 sides in X, but not in A. Now, is this possible? So we know in the actual world that a square has 4 sides, but is there a possible world where a square does not have 4 sides? Well, it seems like if a square has 4 sides, this is a necessary truth, not a contingent truth. And so to say that a square has 4 sides is to say that in every possible world, a square does actually have 4 sides. Or what about the sentence, 2 plus 2 equals 4 in X, but not in A? Well, again, here we seem to be making a category mistake, because to say that 2 plus 2 equals 4 in X is not just a contingent truth that happens to be the case in our world. This is the case in every possible world. But now when it comes to the existence of Mike existing, Mike does not exist in all possible worlds, but I do exist in the actual world. And so what we need to ask is, what kind of being is God? Is God a necessary or a contingent necessary being? Or is God, according to modal logic, a logically necessary being? Well, again, we go back to our definition of God, that which none greater can be conceived. This is how you would state the argument using modal logic. It is possible that a maximally great being exists. 2. If it is possible that a maximally great being exists, then a maximally great being exists in some possible worlds. That's, again, using modal logic. So is it even possible for God to exist, the maximally great being? If you say yes, then that means there is one possible world, at least one possible world, that God exists. 3. If a maximally great being exists in some possible worlds, then it exists in every possible world. And so if a maximally great being exists in every possible world, then it exists in the actual world. And so our conclusion is, if a maximally great being exists in the actual world, then a maximally great being exists, therefore a maximally great being actually exists. And so what we're saying here is, for God to be that which none greater can be conceived, we're saying that God is a logically necessary being. The definition of God is a being whose existence is necessary. So just like to say 2 plus 2 necessarily equals 4, if we said 2 plus 2 does not equal 4, like let's say we say 2 plus 2 equals 5, that would be a logical contradiction. And so it would be a meaningless statement. And so what this argument is trying to demonstrate is that to say that God does not exist is to also utter a logical contradiction. Just like saying 2 plus 2 does not equal 4 would be a contradiction. And so this statement, a being who exists out of logical necessity does not exist, which is, by the way, the definition of God, according to the modal argument, is to say something as meaningless as 2 plus 2 does not equal 4. And so again, the argument says, if God exists in one possible world, if it's possible that this definition of God is true, God being a logically necessary being, then by definition, that means that God exists in every possible world, which means that God exists in the actual world. And so to recap, we have Anselm's version of the argument, which is God is a contingent necessary being. That is, conceptually, God is that which none greater can be conceived. And so if God is that which none greater can be conceived, then God exists by definition. And then you have God as a logically necessary being, which is to say that God exists in every possible world using modal logic. And if that's the case, then God exists in the actual world. So that's all I have for this lecture. Again, we focused just on this lecture on the ontological argument. We won't cover any of the material on Chapter 9, so make sure that you read the chapter on religious experience. And again, if you have any questions about that, you can certainly email me.